Although the notion that there is just one Islam is held by a large portion of the Muslim community, there's still varying beliefs about what true Islam actually is. Starting at number 10, we have the Sunnis. So 85% of the Muslim world are Sunnis, so they make up the majority, clearly. And Sunnis consider themselves to be the guardians of Islamic orthodoxy and tradition based on what the Prophet Muhammad established, as well as his 4 rightly guided caliphs. The source of the religion and the legal authority are the Quran and the Hadith. And then there's analogy or qiyas and consensus, which is ijma, that's used to resolve certain problems and disputes of matters that may rise that may not be explicitly mentioned in the Quran or the Hadith. And under Sharia, they believe that both individual as well as communal life should be guided by Sharia. The next branch we're looking at is Shia. Shia, or the Shiites, they began as a political dispute over the leadership of Islam. And they considered Ali, who was a cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, as the first legitimate successor to the Prophet Muhammad. And that's when we had Shia Ali, which is the party of Ali. And Shiites believe that the revelation ended with the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran. However, they also consider there to be a tradition of imams who were given supernatural powers to interpret the Sharia. The teachings of the imams are considered infallible, by the way. And now Shias are generally synonymous with the term seveners because they believe that there was a series of 7 imams that succeeded the martyrdom of Hussein, which was Ali's youngest son. Shias also have traditionally believed in the existence of a Mahdi, which is sort of like a messiah figure who will one day appear to restore the purity of all of Islam. Currently, Shias make up the majority in modern Iran, as well as they make up an influential minority in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Pakistan, and Iraq. Branch at number 8 are the Kharijites. And now the Kharijite means those who defected from the group. And now they were members of the earliest sect in Islam that left the followers of Ali, who was a cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, the 3rd Caliph, Uthman, was killed in the year 656 AD, and the struggle for succession followed between Ali and Muawiyah, the governor of Damascus. Now, the Kharijites left the followers of Ali, who are the Shias, and the Kharijites rejected the firstborn succession of the Quraysh, which was a tribe of the Prophet Muhammad, and they assert that the leadership of Islam, which is known as the Caliphate, should be designated by an imam that's elected by the community from among candidates who possess spiritual and other important personal qualities. Next up, let's talk about the Ibadi. Now, this is a school of Islam that's dominant in Oman, and although Ibadism is often described as conservative, it is considered to be a tolerant sect of Islam, which puts a lot of emphasis on the rule of the just, and it rejects violence as a means to political ends. Now, Oman is the only country in the Muslim world that has an Ibadi majority population. Now, the roots of Ibadism go all the way back to the 7th century, 20 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632. One thing to note about Ibadis is that they can trace their origins also back to the Kharijites, who came into existence during the First Islamic Civil War between 656 and 661. The Kharijites, by the way, were the earliest Islamic sect who came about as a result of the religio-political controversy over the caliphate. But this offshoot of the Kharijites, the Ibadi, they believe that the Muslim community can rule itself without a single leader. Ibadis also differ in that they do not agree that a Muslim leader must be a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad's tribe. In theology, Ibadis reject a literal interpretation of all human-like descriptions of God, denying even the possibility of seeing God in this life or even in the afterlife. Next up, we have the Sufis. Sufism is an Arabic word called tasawwuf, and the word means made of wool, and that refers to the coarse wool garments that were worn by the earlier Muslim mystics as a symbol of poverty and a rejection of worldly pleasures. Sufism is defined as Islamic mysticism, and Sufism is less of a doctrine or belief system than it is an experience and way of life. It is a tradition of enlightenment that carries the essential truth forward throughout time. Now, this tradition, however, must be conceived in a vital and dynamic sense. Now, its expression must not remain limited to the religious and cultural forms of the past. The truth of Sufism requires reformation and fresh expression in every single age. Now, research has shown that only 5% of the total Muslim population in the world follow Sufism. Halfway in at number 5, we have the Ahmadiyya. Now, many Muslims protest that they are not even Muslims at all. But for the sake of this video, I included them because they do identify as Islam. Now, the Ahmadi Muslim Jamaat, or the AMJ, is a growing international revival movement within Islam. It was founded back in the year 1889, and the AMJ is the only Islamic organization to believe that the long-awaited Messiah has actually come in the person of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who was born in 1835 and lived up until the year 1908, and he was from Kadian, India. Now, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad claimed to have been divinely appointed as both the promised Mahdi, the guided one, and the Messiah expected by Muslims to appear towards the end of time. Ahmadis believe that God sent Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, like Jesus, to end religious wars, condemn bloodshed, and reinstitute morality, justice, and peace in the world. So with that, followers of Ahmadiyya do not recognize the Prophet Muhammad as the last prophet. The largest concentration of Ahmadiyya Muslims are in West and Eastern Africa, Indonesia, as well as South Asia. Now let's take a look at Wahhabism. Now this is a conservative movement within Islam's Sunni branch, and it's named after its founder, theologian Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was born in the 18th century in what is now Saudi Arabia. Wahhab advocated a return to a purer form of Islam, focusing on its origins and the absolute sovereignty of God. So that means they reject all the cults of saints, as well as they forbid tobacco, alcohol, and shaving. And their mosques are very plain and simple, as well as their public prayer attendance is heavily enforced. Now, the term Wahhabism is often seen as derogatory because followers were first called out by people that didn't agree with them. So many of them prefer to be called Salafis, which is in reference to Salaf, which was the first, second, and third generation of the people that lived at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Only 3 left, and at number 3 we have Quranism. And the word Quranism describes a branch of Islam where the Quran is accepted as a revelation from God, but the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, as well as the entire collection of the Hadith, are completely rejected. So those who share this belief are known as Quranists, and the doctrine that the Quranists follow states that the message in the Quran is clear and complete, so it can be understood without looking for external references like the Sunnah or the Hadith to clear up any sort of misunderstanding that may be in the Quran. Now, Islamic scholars actually condemn this belief, and they point to the fact that the Quran commands Muslims to follow the example or the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. And many scholars add that without the Hadith literature, many Islamic concepts would just be completely abstract and not have any real substance to them. For example, in the Hadith, you find how to pray and fast, as well as the obligatory giving, how to conduct that, and also how to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, which are all parts of the 5 pillars of Islam. Madhavis come at number 2. Madhavis believe in the oneness of Allah as well as the prophethood of Muhammad as the last messenger of Allah. And they also consider the Quran to be their holy book. Now, they strictly follow the 5 pillars of Islam. They follow the Sunnah tradition and Sharia while having high respect and reverence for the house of the Prophet Muhammad and his immediate offspring. Now, if you're not familiar with the term Madhavism, it's also known as Zikri in Pakistan, if you're familiar with that term. Well, anyways, it's a Muslim sect that was founded by Sayyid Muhammad Janpuri, who was born in India in the late 15th century. Now, Sayyid Muhammad declared himself to be the Imam Mahdi at the holy city of Mecca in front of the Kaaba in 1496 and is revered as such by the Madhaviya community throughout the entire world. Now, Zikri Madhavis can be found predominantly in the Baluchistan province of Pakistan. And finally, at number 1, we have the Nation of Islam. This was founded in Detroit in 1930 by Wallace Fard, who proclaimed a revelation for the African Americans that their salvation would come through self-knowledge by which they would recover a sense of their own history. Now, Elijah Muhammad was Fard's successor after Fard's mysterious disappearance back in the year 1934. Elijah Muhammad taught that Fard was an incarnation of Allah, and he commanded that other blacks who followed the movement were to withdraw from white society and create their own institutions, start up their own businesses. And now the traditional teachings of the Nation of Islam include the belief that humanity was originally black and that the white race was created by a black scientist named Yaqub, who had rebelled against Allah. They also consider Christianity to be a danger because it's a religion of Western culture. Now, followers of the Nation of Islam, they stick to a strict lifestyle of praying 5 times a day. They abstain from alcohol, tobacco, as well as other drugs. They try to have a pure and simple diet as much as possible, among other practices. Now, the prominent members of the Nation of Islam include Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. Islam is one of the world's major religions, and it was promoted by the Prophet Muhammad in Arabia in the 7th century. The Arabic term Islam means surrender, and it really sheds some light on the fundamental religious idea of Islam, which is that the believer, called a Muslim, fully surrenders to the will of Allah, the term for God in Arabic. Inside this religion, despite many claiming that Islam is united and has only one religious path, there are still various schools of thought and branches of Islam that exist today. Sunni is the largest branch of Islam, and it represents about 90% of all the followers of Islam worldwide. Sunni Islam is the largest religious denomination, followed by Catholicism, and Sunnis regard their branch as the mainstream and traditionalist branch of Islam. Sunni followers believe that Muhammad had not appointed a specific successor, and many years after the death of the Prophet and a lot of debate, followers chose Abu Bakr to be the successor. Abu Bakr became the first openly declared Muslim outside of Muhammad's family. Abu Bakr had served as a very trusted advisor to the Prophet Muhammad. Now, when we look a little bit closer inside what the Sunnis believe, well, a lot of their beliefs really emphasize the views of their community at large. With the Sunnis instituting consensus, this allowed them to incorporate various different customs that came through historical development but don't necessarily have any base roots in the Quran. The Sunnis also recognize the 6 sound books of Hadith, and these books of Hadith contain spoken tradition that's attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. The Sunnis also accept the 4 schools of Islamic law. Okay, so now moving on to the next branch of Islam that I want to talk about, Shia. The Shia, sometimes written as Shiite, is a movement within Islam, and it has very political origins. So after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in AD 632, the founders of the Shia movement, they wanted power to pass to the Prophet's son-in-law and cousin named Ali, and then to his male successors from there on out. And Shias believe that Muhammad personally chose Ali to be his successor. In the Shia faith, they also have imams, and these are people that are more central figures as well as community leaders. Shias have a great influence in the contemporary world in Iran, where nearly 90% of the Muslims are Shia Muslims. But Shia are also the majority in Iraq, Bahrain, and Yemen. Now, I'm sure most of us have heard of the 5 pillars of Islam. Well, the 5 pillars of Islam, yes, they're shared between Shia and Sunni faiths. However, the 5 pillars are represented differently in Shia Islam. The 5 principal pillars of Shia are Tawheed, which is the oneness of God, Nubuwah, which is prophethood, resurrection, divine justice, and imama, which is a belief in the political and spiritual supremacy of the Prophet's successors. Now, before we continue, we have done several videos that explore the religion of Islam in a lot more details. I do have a playlist in the card section of this episode. There's also a link in the video description, and I'll also have the playlist at the end of this episode. And in it, there's a video where we talk a lot about the differences between the Shia and the Sunni Muslims, a lot more in detail, so you definitely want to check that out. The third branch of Islam now that I'm going to talk about is Ibadi. Ibadi is a school of Islam that's very dominant in the country of Oman. Although Ibadism is often described as very conservative, it is considered a tolerant sect of Islam, and it emphasizes the rule of the just and rejects violence as a means to political ends. The Ibadi population is very small when you compare it to the Sunni and Shia Muslim population. There are roughly 2.72 million Ibadis in the world, and most of them live in Oman. Oman is also the only country in the Muslim world that has an Ibadi majority as its population. Now, the roots of Ibadism stem from the 7th century, about 20 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Ibadis can be traced back to the Kharijites, who came into existence during the First Islamic Civil War back in 1656 to 1661. Kharijites were the earliest Islamic sect, and they emerged as a result of the religio-political controversy over the Caliphate. And the Caliphate is a political religious state comprising the Muslim community and the land as well as the people under its dominion in the centuries following the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And another thing that makes the Ibadis distinct from the other Muslim branches is that Ibadis believe that the Muslim community can govern themselves. They do not need any sort of religious central figure. And they're also distinct in that Ibadis do not believe that a Muslim leader needs to be a descendant of the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad. Next up, I want to introduce Ahmadiyya. The Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat is a very dynamic and it's also a fast-growing international movement within Islam. It was founded in 1889. The Ahmadiyya is the only Islamic organization to believe that the long-awaited Messiah has come in the person of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who was born in 1835 to 1908 in Qadian, India. Mirza Ghulam Ahmad claimed that he was divinely appointed as both the promised Mahdi, which is the guided one, and Messiah expected by Muslims to appear towards the end times of the earth and bring about a very peaceful triumph of Islam all across the world. It's also believed that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad would embody the expected religious figure of major religions around the world. The Ahmadiyya believe that God sent Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, just like Jesus, to end religious wars, condemn violence and bloodshed, and reinstitute morality in the world, as well as justice and peace worldwide. So with that said, the followers of Ahmadiyya Islam do not believe that Muhammad is the final prophet. Now, the largest populations of Ahmadiyya Muslims are found in Indonesia, West and East Africa, as well as South Asia. As part of their efforts to really revive Islam, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, they continue to spread Ahmad's teachings of moderation and restraint, and all of this in the face of opposition from other Muslim groups. The Ahmadiyya Muslim community also believes in the separation of mosque and state, so the difference between religion and politics. They want to keep that completely separate. Over a century ago, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, he taught his followers to protect the sanctity of both religion and government by becoming righteous souls following your religious practices, as well as being loyal and faithful following the laws of the land, but never ever combine the two of them. Now, the final group I'm talking about in this episode is Sufis. Sufism, known as Tasawwuf in the Arabic-speaking world, is a form of mystical Islam, and they really emphasize the beliefs and practices in which Muslims can seek and find a path to divine love and knowledge through direct personal experiences of God. The Sufi practice focuses a lot on the renunciation of material things. They focus a lot on the purification of the soul, and followers try to get closer to God by seeking spiritual learning known as tariqah. One of the most important rituals in Sufism is the zikr. During a zikr, one remembers God through meditation, chants, as well as a lot of body movement. Certain attributes and qualities of God are repeated by the person until they become saturated with God. Now, this ritual is supposedly supposed to transform them, and as they dance and move around for hours, they reach a state of ecstasy in which they purify their heart, where they are only conscious of the presence of God. This is a complete surrender and a complete emptiness to self. They believe that this experience of higher consciousness and being one with God does not have to wait until paradise. It can actually be achieved now, right here on earth as we know it. Turkey and Persia are actually considered to be centers of Sufism throughout the world, but Sufism has also reached Greece, Albania, and Macedonia, as well as other places.
Islam is often represented by several major branches like Sunni, Shia, and Sufism, and these branches started to develop after the Prophet Muhammad's passing, when people began to disagree on who the successor of Islam should be. Well, in this episode, I'll be taking a look at 10 sects that branched from Islam. Many Muslims consider these sects simply as different religions entirely. Starting with the sect at number 10, we have Sunni. 85% of Muslims are Sunni, and they consider themselves to be the guardians of Islamic tradition as established by the Prophet Muhammad and the 4 rightly guided caliphs. Sources of religious and legal authority are the Quran and the Hadith, and then there's analogy or qiyas, as well as consensus, which is ijma. They are used to resolve problems not explicitly mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith, so those also play a very important role in the religion. Sunnis also believe that both individual as well as communities should be guided by Sharia law. And that brings us to our next sect, the Maliki. The Maliki school is one of the 4 major sects of Islam within Sunni Islam. Now, it was founded by Malik ibn Anas in 8th century, and the Maliki school of jurisprudence or school of thought relies on the Quran and the Hadith as its primary sources. Maliki also considers consensus of the people of Medina to be a valid source of Islamic law. Now, it's also one of the largest groups of Sunni Muslims. Number 8 brings us to the sect of the Shafi'i. The Shafi'i sect is also one of the 4 schools of thought in Sunni Islam, one of the 4 main ones, and it was founded by the Arab scholar named Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, and he was a student of Malik in the early 9th century. Now, this sect actually rejected provincial dependence on the traditional community practices as the source of legal ruling, and they argued for the unquestioning acceptance of the Hadith as the major basis for legal and religious judgments. Also, the foundational text for the Shafi'i school of thought or sect is known as the Al-Risala, which means the message, and this was created by the founder of the sect, Al-Shafi'i. The sect at number 7 is the Hanbali. Now, the Hanbali sect is also another one of the 4 major Sunni schools of Islamic thought. Now, it's named after the Iraqi scholar named Ahmed ibn Hanbal, and the belief system of this sect was then institutionalized by his students. The Hanbali sect is the smallest of the 4 major Sunni branches, by the way, and the scholars of the Hanbali school are also referred to as Al-Hadith. The next sect I want to talk about in this episode is the Hanafi sect. This is considered to be the oldest and most liberal school of law, once again within the Sunni branch of Islam. The Hanafi sect was named after its founder, Imam Abu Hanifa, and it's a major school of Iraq Sunni Arabs. This sect uses reason or opinion in legal decisions. Also, the Hanafi sect, for the most part, is decentralized, and that made it very difficult for the 20th century rulers to incorporate its religious leaders into stronger, more centralized state systems. Continuing now to number 5, here we talk about Shia. The Shia, also known as Shiites, they began as a political dispute over the leadership of Islam. Now, they considered Ali, the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, as the first legitimate successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Now, Shiites also believe the revelation ended with Muhammad and the Quran. However, they also consider that there is to be a tradition of imams who are granted powers to interpret the Sharia law as well as help govern the Muslim community. You've probably heard the term, even if you're not Muslim, Ayatollah. Well, that term means sign of Allah, and it's a title used in Shia Islam. And the person with this title is considered to be someone so righteous that he can make independent judgments that carry the authority of the Imam. Shia Muslims are the ruling majority in modern Iran, as well as Shias are also found in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Pakistan, and Iraq. And of course, you'll find smaller groups in different parts of the world. Speaking of Shias though, we got to talk about the Twelvers. They come in at number 4. Now, Twelver Shiaism is the largest branch of Shia Muslims. It's also the majority sect in Iran, where it is the state religion. And the very term Twelver, actually, it refers to the belief in the 12 divinely ordained imams. Now, these 12 men were to be descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, and for them, the 12 imams carry great power, and this power not only allows them to rule over the Muslim community with justice, but also it qualifies them to interpret the not so clear meanings of the Quran. The Twelver Shiite sect fully accepts the oneness of God and the Quran, and they also acknowledge Muhammad as the final prophet, but also, like the general belief in Shia Islam, they consider the words and the deeds of the imams as holding a lot of power, not just in their own immediate families, but also in the Muslim communities on a whole. The sect at number number 3 is Ismaili. Now, the Ismailism is another branch or subsect of Shia Islam. The Ismailis also get their name from Imam Ismail ibn Jafar as the appointed Imam to Jafar al-Siddiq. So that's where the Ismailis differ from the Twelvers who accept Musa al-Kadhim, which was a younger brother of Ismail, as the true Imam. Ismailism, it rose to a huge point actually to become one of the largest branches in Shia Islam, and it peaked as a political power within the Fatimid Caliphate in the 10th all the way up until the 12th centuries. At number 2, we have to talk about the Sufis. The word Sufis, not many people know, but it means woolen, and this actually refers to the coarse wool clothing that were worn by early Muslim mystics as a symbol of poverty and rejecting all the pleasures of the world. Sufis trace their origins back to the Prophet Muhammad as well as the Quran, and they teach that early Islam was a lot more concerned with the true spiritual matters as opposed to more materialistic matters, as well as discussing strict laws and all of that. There was one professor of theology, Al-Ghazali, and at one point he sought to combine the legalistic as well as the mystical schools of Islam, and he prescribed Sufism as a remedy for spiritual problems in the world, not just in Islam, but in the world in general. And finally, the last sect that we're going to look at in this episode is the Nation of Islam. Now, this sect was founded in Detroit in the United States in 1930 by Wallace Fard. Now, this was a man who said that he had a revelation from God for the African Americans that their salvation would come through self-knowledge, and a lot of this knowledge was tied into African Americans just learning about their own history. A man by the name of Elijah Muhammad was Wallace Fard's successor after he mysteriously disappeared in 1934. Nobody knows where Wallace Fard went after that. But his followers, they maintain a strict lifestyle. They pray 5 times a day, they avoid intoxicants, they don't use any tobacco, no alcohol, they eat a pure diet, no haram foods, and they stay away from intimate relationships outside of marriage. Malcolm X, as well as Elijah Muhammad's son, Wallace D. Muhammad, they made attempts to really bring the Nation of Islam more in line with traditional Islam. But it still, for the most part, operates as its own sect or religion. The Muslim community will tell you that Islam is only one religion. And although that is true in one sense, there still are various branches and schools of thought all under the banner of Islam, most notably Sunni and Shia. Starting at number 10, first we gotta look at the split. So Islam split into 2 main branches after the Prophet Muhammad had passed away in the year 632, and these 2 groups came to be known as Sunni and Shia. Sunni came to mean a person or a group who follows the teachings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, and the title comes from Sunnah, which means tradition. Now, the word Shia refers to a person or a group who follows the path of Ali, and he was the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad and also the 4th Caliph or ruler of Islam. And the root word for Shia means following. Now, most people in these groups recognize each other as equally Muslim because many of their core beliefs are the same, which I'll be talking about a little bit more later on in this episode. But number 9, let's look at the respect that they have for the Prophet. Both Sunni and Shia Muslims, they respect the Prophet Muhammad, and also they respect his family and the companions. Both groups recognize Abu Bakr ibn Abi Quhafa, as well as Umar ibn al-Khattab, as well as Uthman ibn Affan, and also Ali ibn Abi Talib, and they believe them to be successive caliphs. All were virtuous companions of the Prophet Muhammad. You'll find this in both Sunni and Shia Islam. Ali is also respected by both. Let's talk a little bit more about Ali ibn Abi Talib, who lived from 601 to 661 AD, and his relationship with the Prophet Muhammad is one of 2 main points of difference between Sunni and Shia Muslims, but he is greatly honored by both Sunni and Shia. Both recognize him to be the cousin as well as son-in-law and companion of the Prophet. While Shias consider him to be the first infallible Imam, Sunnis recognize him as one of the 4 righteous caliphs. Both of them recognize him as the 4th caliph, like I just mentioned a little bit earlier. And by the way, caliph is a leader or ruler of the Muslim community. Now let's look at intermarrying. So here's the thing, neither Sunni or Shia law forbids marrying within Islam. Now, when it comes to the various different schools of Islamic law, some scholars say that they are equally religiously valid to follow in all religious practices. So whether you're practicing some schools of thought that align with Sunnis or Shias, either way, equally valid when it comes to being a Muslim. But again, that's just the opinion of many scholars out there. Moving on to number 6, we're talking about Hussein and Ashura. Hussein, who lived from 626 to 680, the son of Ali and the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, he actually ended up losing his life in Karbala, Iraq in a very violent way. And the day that he was killed is called Ashura. Shias specifically celebrate this day, but certain Sunnis also join in on them, although it's not necessarily a Sunni practice. But it is safe to say that all Muslims, regardless of the branch, really highly respect Hussein. All right, so number 5, there's different interpretations of the faith. So the split between Sunnis and Shias, they often compare it to the split between Catholicism and Protestantism within Christianity. But that's not necessarily the most accurate comparison, but it kind of gives you an idea. Either way, both Sunni and Shia Muslims, they believe in and follow the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, many of their traditions are the same, like fasting and doing a pilgrimage to Mecca. But Sunnis generally focus more on interpreting Islamic scripture, while Shias, they mainly focus on being guided by their religious leaders. They put a lot of emphasis on that. Now, for number 4, both Sunnis and Shias also recognize the Mahdi. The Mahdi is a title of the promised savior who will lead the world to peace. Now, the Mahdi will also set the stage for the return of Isa, also known as Jesus, in the end times, to fully establish peace on earth. Shias and Sunnis both believe that the Mahdi will come from the lineage of Fatima, who was the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, most Shias believe that the Mahdi is Muhammad al-Mahdi, who is already born and has been miraculously hidden by God since the year 941 AD. Sunnis, on the other hand, they believe that the Mahdi is not born yet, and they believe that his name will also be Muhammad, but his full name will be Muhammad ibn Abdullah. Next up, let's talk about the call for union. The division between the two main branches happened very early on, but the differences mainly were in theology and not necessarily a division of the community. Even Imam Abu Hanifa, he was actually the founder of the largest school of jurisprudence in Sunni Islam, the Hanafi school of thought. He was a student of Imam Jafar Sadiq, who was the 6th Shia Imam. And in very recent history, even up to modern days, the two branches really supported each other when it comes to fights against invaders. And also the Grand Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, he encourages calling Sunnis the other self of Shia Muslims. For fact number 2, we look at majority versus minority. According to the Pew Research Center, they estimate that around 10 to 13% of the world's Muslim population was Shia and around 87 to 90% was Sunni. Most Shias live in Iran, Pakistan, and you'll also find some in India and Iraq. And in Iran, though, it's estimated that 95% of the Muslim population there are Shia Muslims, and most Shias in the world actually live in Iran. And there's many other countries out there that have large Sunni majorities, like Egypt, Jordan, and of course, Saudi Arabia. And the fact that we're gonna end this episode on is looking at the diversity within the branches. So I told you this was coming up. So neither Sunni nor Shia is a single fixed ideology. The various groups of Shia Islam at the start were categorized based on the number of imams that they follow. Sunnis, on the other hand, their group was based on their theological schools of thought. So within the Shia branch, there are several sub-branches. For example, the followers of the largest branch are known as Twelvers. You've probably heard that term before, because they believe that there were 12 leaders known as imams after the Prophet Muhammad. Now in Sunni Islam, there's various different schools of thought that exist, and they have different views on interpreting Islamic law. You'll find Hanafi, Wahhabi, as well as several other ones. But yes, when you say Sunni and Shia, those aren't necessarily accurate labels because, again, you have to take in consideration the various different sub-branches. However, with all this said and done, they still fall under the umbrella of Islam.